Good evening and welcome to our FreeStyle Libre webinar on understanding exercise using the FreeStyle Libre system. We would like to thank you all for joining and hope you find all the information presented useful and informative. Now on to the webinar. The purpose of today's webinar is to provide you a practical guide to using the FreeStyle Libre system to help you manage your diabetes while exercising. During this webinar, you will first hear from Chris Pennell, who is a Premiership rugby player, and will explain how, with the help of the FreeStyle Libre system, he is able to manage his diabetes while exercising. This will be followed by Dr. Ian Gallen, a consultant diabetologist, who will be talking about how managing your glucose while exercising and tips to help you manage this. At the end of the webinar, we will have time for questions. You can ask a question by typing it into your chat window at the bottom left-hand side of the screen. We will attempt to answer as many questions as possible. Please note that we are not able to answer clinical or individual healthcare questions during this webinar. You should contact your healthcare team if you do have any specific clinical questions. Following the webinar, we will email a questionnaire to all of you for feedback on how you found today. The webinar slides and recording will be available on demand following today's webinar. Hopefully, by the end of the session, you will all be better positioned to manage your diabetes while exercising. Now let me pass on to Chris Pennell.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Chris Pennell. I'm a professional rugby player for the Worcester Warriors, and I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes age 19. I'll just give you a little bit of background as to my diagnosis story, if I may. I came straight out of school and into the academy at Worcester Warriors. I spent a year in the academy as a full-time professional, and managed to secure another couple of years at that time, contract-wise. It wasn't until that pre-season, my second pre-season with the club, that I was diagnosed with diabetes, and this came around through a pre-season blood test, and it's a test that's kind of standardised across the board. Every player does it every year, and they just look for sort of general health markers, just to make sure that as athletes we're in good condition, and I guess we're sort of able to make the most of our training. There's nothing kind of underlying or standing out that we need to look after. And the one thing that showed up in my pre-season blood test at that time, back in 2007, was that my blood glucose was abnormally high. I must admit I wasn't too sure what that meant at the time. The club doctor was incredibly supportive and talked me through what this could mean. It was confirmed the following day with a finger prick test that I was type 1 diabetic, and I guess a lot of things kind of fell into place. A lot of things made sense from that moment on. When I think about, I guess all the symptoms were there, but they were masked in a way by what it was I was doing, because I was in pre-season. I was active. Pre-season's a brutal time, so I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was exhausted by the end of the day. I was struggling to put weight on, but I just kind of put it all down to the volume of training and the intensity that we were working. And I guess after the diagnosis, it kind of made sense that actually, maybe I probably shouldn't be drinking as many pints of water as I was in the evenings, or quite passing out that hour after my big plate of pasta, that sort of thing. So things made sense. And I was very, very lucky, very fortunate to be diagnosed in a professional sport environment. I realised that. I realised how rare that is and how lucky I am, because the level of support I received immediately was massive. And you'll hear from Dr. Gallen later on. I was fortunate enough to go and see Dr. Gallen within a month, I think it was, of my diagnosis, and I understand that isn't the norm. So I'm incredibly fortunate to have been in the position I was. Because of that, my attitude towards my diabetes was that it wasn't gonna hold me back, because those are the conversations that I was having at an early stage. That my diagnosis story is relatively positive in terms of yeah, I was told that this isn't going to affect my dreams, as it were, of being a professional rugby player and one day going on to represent my country. So post the diagnosis, my diabetes journey sort of began, and I had to go through plenty of trial and error to figure out how my diabetes worked, because everyone's diabetes is different, and there's no sort of one size fits all solution to this. There are obviously general guidelines, but ultimately I had to take responsibility as a young man and as a someone who wanted to play professional sport. I had to take responsibility for my own diabetes and learn as much as I could about it and about how different things affected it, including exercise and including diet. So allow me just to move us on slightly. So, as I said, I was kind of then put into the world of learning about my diabetes, and it soon became clear that obviously the goal was to try and keep my blood glucose as close to those kind of magic numbers as possible. But this was achieved largely by chasing hypos with food and chasing hypers with insulin. I was kind of going up and down a lot throughout the day, but managing to keep my levels in a pretty good region. And this was just what diabetes was to me, and it wasn't kind of holding me back in any way. I was able to train and I was able to perform. I had a few curveballs thrown in around training in terms of my blood glucose shooting up high, or having to sort of cram in half a packet of dextrose on occasions in the early days when I'd taken a bit too much insulin. The other thing that I struggled with, always have really, is game days and the impact of the matches. My blood glucose spikes very, very high, and I often found it incredibly hard and frustrating to know how to control that, because obviously on game day that's when I need to be at my best, that's when I need to perform. So if I didn't have control over my blood glucose, then it could be problematic. And then I was fortunate enough to be able to have a go with the FreeStyle Libre system, and I can honestly say that it changed my life. It changed my confidence with my diabetes. It gave me the ability to make some really positive changes when it came to my management and came to looking after myself as a professional. And the one thing that I did notice very early on was that the data it was giving me, kind of filling in the blanks between tests, was invaluable. Previously, I was going to bed with my blood glucose finger prick test, and my blood glucose was at a good level. I would wake up in the morning and I would finger prick test again, and I was happy with where my levels were at. And I kind of assumed that throughout that nighttime period, I was just cruising along at a really nice level, with no issues, no sort of indication as to anything else going on. It wasn't until I hooked up to the Libre system that I realised the majority of the evenings, particularly after I'd had an intense training day, I was dropping into hypoglycemia. I wasn't waking up more often than not. So this was obviously a bit of a shock at the time, but I'm incredibly grateful for the Libre system, because it's data that I wouldn't have been able to get otherwise without setting the alarm every hour, I guess, to see where I was at. So because of that data, it allowed me to make some positive changes when it came to my diabetes management. As I say, the way I kind of see the Libre system is it's a bit of a test between those standard glucose testing times. Obviously, the finger prick testing was giving me a snapshot as to where I was at, and I was kind of having to fill in the blanks in between, and often assuming that my glucose was at a good level. And because of that data, as I say, it allowed me to make some positive changes to my management. And when it came to those nighttime hypos, I discussed it with my nutritionist, and we thought that it might be a good idea for me to take on board a decent amount of carbohydrate just prior to going to sleep, so a low GI. Kind of trying to make a smart choice as to what type of carbohydrate that was. So particularly after heavy training days, I was having that kind of snack late on in the evening, and that did actually solve the problem. The other thing that the Libre did for me at that time was it gave me that data during training and during matches. And I just think that generally it allowed me to open my eyes to looking at new ways of managing my diabetes that previously I wouldn't have had the confidence to do without that data, without knowing exactly what was going on during matches, during training, during the nights. The biggest change that I made was my diet, and I realised that can be a very sensitive subject. I know diets are incredibly individual, and there can be a bit of a war on diets going on. I'm not here to try and add fuel to the fire or debate any of that tonight. All I can do is speak about my experiences and what has worked for me. I'm certainly not suggesting that everybody needs to take the same approach, but my diet change was the most positive change that I've made, and it was because of the Libre system that I had that confidence to do so. So I explored different approaches to diet, different approaches not only because of the diabetes but also because of my sport. So I did a lot of research and investigation into a ketogenic diet, which is basically an incredibly low carbohydrate diet, and using fat for my main source of energy. I'll just nudge on to my sort of latest readings in comparison to the ones that I've shown you previously. As you can see, the first graph kind of gives that indication as chasing those hypos with food, and the hypers with insulin. And the bottom graph is one from a few weeks back, which just shows obviously a much more stable blood glucose level that I've been able to achieve through diet. I still get the issues around training, even though the carbohydrate isn't there as such, isn't a major influence on my training or my match day preparation. I still get the spikes in blood glucose around certain sessions, around the high intensity or sessions with lots of contact, particularly our defense sessions, for example. I know that I need to be careful with what I'm doing, and also around game day. You can see on the bottom chart those kind of spikes at around sort of 10 o'clock, just before midday. And then this graph was actually from a couple of weeks back now, and I had a couple of evening matches, which is the little nudge up at around 7 o'clock. So the Libre system allowed me to have the confidence to change my approach with diet, but also, as I mentioned earlier, gave me the confidence to make some adaptations around my training. And what I've now started to do is I've actually started to identify the training sessions that do cause that spike in my blood glucose, and I'm now injecting small amounts of fast-acting insulin prior to those sessions to try and maintain a better level. And that's actually worked quite well for me so far. Likewise for game days, I took the step of starting to inject a little bit of fast-acting insulin before the game. Would see where I was at. If I had a Libre sensor on, I could see where I was at in stops in play. The physio would bring on my scanner, see where I was at. But then at half time, if my blood glucose was still high, which usually it is, I take another little bit of insulin. That approach has now changed slightly. I now take, previously I was just taking 1 unit before a game, 1 unit at half time. I'm taking 4 units of fast-acting insulin before the game, and then I'm seeing where I'm at half time. I tend to be at a much better level at half time than I have been previously. Sometimes as well at half time, that means I can take on board a little bit of carbohydrate, which gives me that sort of a little bit of a boost going into the second half. Something that I think the human body's incredible at is using the available fuel sources. So having that metabolic flexibility means that if I do take on board that fast-acting carbohydrate, it can sometimes give me a bit of a boost. coming to the end of the game. So, as I say, the Libre system allowed me to make some really positive change for my diabetes management and also my sport. Everyone's changes will be different, but I guess the small things do make a big difference overall. And without the data that the Libre system was giving me at that time, I honestly don't think I would have had the confidence to make the changes I've made. I certainly wouldn't have had the confidence to do anything sort of drastic in terms of that bigger change on my diet. Yeah, really happy to answer any questions towards the end, but I'm thrilled to pass you on to someone that certainly helped me a huge amount early on in my diagnosis, and that's Dr. Gallen.
Thanks, Chris. Good evening to everybody. Thank you for all joining in this event. So my aim this evening is to try and give the background of the things to help you control your diabetes with various activities and some history. I've been doing this for about 20 years, and how I started was that so Stephen Redgrave came to see me with a diagnosis of diabetes before the Olympic Games in Sydney, and the conventional wisdom was that he would need to stop his sporting career. And I felt that we could work together to ensure that he could continue to row. And he and I learned a lot together. And from that time, we found out that a lot of the conventional advice was incorrect and began to make strategies that would help people with diabetes. Now, these strategies were then tested in scientific studies and shown to be some of them correct and some of them not correct. And then other people become interested in the field, and we've got more and more information. Perfect. So what do people with type 1 diabetes notice when they exercise? Well, for many activities, the primary event is falling blood glucose and sometimes hypoglycemia, and that would be a very typical response. But as I've already been answering questions from some of you writing in, some of you notice that your blood glucose rises quite markedly. As one of the people who's written in about squash, which would be a very good example. Sometimes there's very little change. You can do a field game like hockey or football, and the blood glucose remains remarkably steady. For all people, after exercise, it can be very difficult to control blood glucose after exercise. And for all people with diabetes, again, it can be difficult to control blood glucose at night time without having hypoglycemia. And I'll try and go through why that is. Some people get very frustrated by this because they think that exercise should all do the same thing, and it doesn't, and I'll explain why that is. And they come to the conclusion that either there's something unusual about their body, or alternatively, they're doing something wrong. But I hope to show that's not the case. So I want to spend some time on this slide here, which is very helpful. On this slide, you'll see on the top panel cartoons of 4 different sorts of exercises. Aerobic exercise, by which I mean exercise that is sustainable, that's below your 85% your maximum predicted heart rate, and that you can do for many hours. It's aerobic because all the fuel is completely burnt to carbon dioxide, and there's no residual acids left in your body. So this would be typically of cycling, running, many forms of swimming, rowing. In the other extreme, you have anaerobic exercise, by which I mean exercise that's limited by the buildup of waste products such as lactate and other acids in your body, and it's very short-lived. And these are typically sprint exercises. And I'll give you an example of that. If you watch the cyclist in the Tour de France, in the peloton across the flat part of France, those people are working completely aerobically. And it's almost limitless. They can cycle for hours on end. But as they start to go up the climbs, particularly the steeper climbs, they become slower. And eventually, some of them may not be able to cycle at all and fall off their bikes. So they've moved from aerobic exercise to anaerobic exercise. And the person who wins the Tour de France is the person who can stand the highest level of lactate in their bloodstream. In the middle 2 panels are mixed exercise. So the first one is intermittent exercise. So this would be a game like rugby or hockey, where you're doing some running but you're also doing some sprint work, but also standing, doing nothing for a bit. So there's intermittent high intensity and low intensity exercise. And the last panel is gym, where you're doing resistance exercise, where you're using different muscle groups and different repetitions. If you then look down to the next panel, the controls, you can see that for people without diabetes, blood sugar remains very constant throughout, except for the anaerobic, where there's a peak of blood glucose which is rapidly corrected. But for people with diabetes, treated with insulin, type 1, with aerobic activity, blood glucose almost invariably falls, and the falls can be quite significant. They can drop 10 to 15 millimoles in an hour. When I first saw continuous glucose traces, I was quite surprised by how quickly the falls were. At the other extreme, an anaerobic exercise, such as a game of squash at the end of the afternoon when the insulin levels are low, you see the same rise in glucose that people without diabetes have, but the blood glucose stays up and continues to be up. For the two middle panels, the pattern of blood glucose response depends on how much aerobic and how much anaerobic exercise is occurring in that activity. So you might think that you go and play a game of rugby, for example, as Chris has done, and on one day your blood glucose might remain very steady, but on another, if you're having a lot of sprint running, blood glucose might go up at the end of the match. But on another day where you're doing lots of aerobic work, lots of running around the park, not much sprinting, it may go down. And this is where devices like the FreeStyle Libre are particularly useful, because you can use those trend arrows to adjust your behavior. So this next cartoon will give you some insight into why that's the case. And I would like to spend some time, I hope it's not too technical, because if you can understand what's happening with your body, it will help you better to work out why the glucose are changing and help you predict. So the first panel is for people without diabetes and for people who've got diabetes, but the exercise is balanced. So by accident, the amount of stress exercise and the amount of aerobic exercise is very balanced. So the glucose production from the liver induced by hormones exactly matches the glucose that's taken up by the muscle. We call those hormones the counter-regulatory hormones, and they're glucagon, growth hormone, cortisol, and catecholamines. In the next panel, for aerobic work, the production of glucose by the liver is much less than the muscles are taking up. So the glucose are continually drawing, the muscles are continually drawing glucose from the blood, and the blood glucose falls. The last panel is the situation with sprint exercise. So the excitement and or stress of judo or squash or sprinting running produces a very strong hormone response, but the amount of glucose that's taken up by the muscles is very little because the exercise is short. And so the blood glucose tends to rise. And one of the people who's written in has asked me, why does his blood glucose rise after squash? And it's because the insulin levels in the body are low, and because the stress of the squash is high, and the muscles of the arms aren't taking a lot of glucose up. Now, I just want to explain that this is also exactly the same mechanism as happens after finishing exercise. So when you've been doing your exercise, the hormones that push your blood sugar up are still there. They don't stop when the exercise stops for a little while, but the muscles stop taking glucose up immediately because they're not working. So the liver is putting more glucose into the system, and so glucose will rise. And this will be particularly marked if you do strategies to reduce your insulin level while you're exercising to avoid hypoglycemia. So this panel here is from one of our consensus papers. We had a meeting of experts on this subject around the world and wrote a best guess basis of what people should do. It's rather complicated, and I'll leave you to read at it another time. But it's to advise you what to do with your blood glucose before starting exercise. So starting at the bottom, if your blood glucose is less than 5, you should consider taking 20 grams of glucose immediately. Now, I just want to spend a minute or two explaining about sugar and glucose. doctors and nurses are very poor at explaining the difference. We discuss blood sugar and taking sugar or glucose. They're not the same thing. So the white stuff that's in cakes, biscuits, sweets, and dissolved in sugar-containing drinks is sucrose. That's a mixture of glucose and fructose together, and it doesn't raise blood glucose until it's gone through the mouth, through the stomach, and into the proximal part of the gut where it's digested. So it takes some time. So many of you will have noticed that if you've got a fall in blood glucose and you take a sugar-containing drink, it doesn't seem to work. So if you want to raise your blood glucose quickly, you've got to take glucose. And glucose comes in very few forms. It comes in dextrosol tablets, jelly babies, gels, and powdered sports drinks that you make up. So going back to the slide, if the glucose levels are slightly higher, between 5 and 7, you should perhaps consider taking 10 grams of glucose, unless you're going to be doing a sprint activity. If blood glucose is between 7 to 9, 7 to 10, you're good to go. If blood glucose is higher than that, particularly if they're higher than about 15, you might consider checking your ketones to make sure you're well. If the ketones are negative and it's just a random high glucose, you can do aerobic activity, but I wouldn't recommend doing sprint activity, which will push your blood sugar up still further. The next panel on this slide covers some of the other things that alter blood glucose. So you shouldn't assume that all the things that change glucose are due to the exercise. There are other things that are going on. So we think about differences in injection sites and absorption. Is the quick-acting insulin that you gave later into a lumpy bit of skin actually taking a long time to be absorbed? Or did you inadvertently give the quick-acting insulin into a muscle so it was acting more quickly? What about carbohydrate intake? Very easy to have a 10 to 20% error in your carbs. So what you think is 30 might be 25 or 35. But that can have a big effect on blood glucose afterwards. There may be errors in the kit. So if you're finding your FreeStyle Libre, it doesn't look like it's accurate, it may not be accurate. You may need to check it with a blood glucose value. If there's been a change in your medication, or you've taken a lot of alcohol the day before, that may change your glucose. For women, physiological cycles, such as the menstrual period, may have some effect. And then finally, changes in work pattern and sleep pattern and shifts, or if you're not very well, can change your glucose. So these are other things you ought to think about if you're noticing very great variability in your blood glucose over and above the sports. And I'd say for the people who come to see me who are referred because of difficulty in controlling glucose and it's attributed to sports, often I find it's not. So the purpose of this talk is to begin to work out some strategies to help you. So what are the global strategies you can use? Well, the first is you can change your insulin levels. So I'll talk about which insulin you should change and when. You can take extra glucose or extra carbohydrate, and again, I'll talk about how much and when. And then finally, there's a neat trick that you can trick your body into making a hormone response to raise your glucose either before doing exercise or during exercise or after your exercise instead of taking glucose. And that's called the maximum sprint. I won't show many of this type of slide, but it's very illustrative. So we now know a tremendous amount about how to reduce your insulin before exercise. So this slide discusses when you should reduce your insulin, which is delivered by a pump before a period of aerobic exercise. So the exercise is around an hour, and what they've done is suspended the insulin either immediately on starting the exercise, which is the round circles, and you can see that had very little effect. There was a very big drop in glucose with that strategy. Or by reducing the insulin basal rate infusion by 50% or 80% 90 minutes before the exercise. And you can see both those are better strategies. And for this particular study, the 80% reduction seemed to have been the better one. Now, how can you use this? If you're on a pump, you can look at your trend arrows to see when was the best time to reduce your insulin before you do the exercise and by how much. So you might start by reducing it by an hour before and reducing it by 50%. And if you find your glucose is still falling, perhaps the next time you do that exercise, stretch it out for earlier and by more. What about for people who are on, what to do about bolus doses? Well, if you're on bolus dose insulin, if you're doing the exercise within 90 minutes to 2 hours, you should think about reducing the bolus dose, either if you inject it or by a pump, before you do the exercise. So there's less active insulin on board. Many of you will have devices telling you how much insulin is on board when you look at your pumps. So this works very well, but if the exercise is more than 2 hours after the last shot of insulin, you can't, reducing the dose of insulin doesn't have any benefit. For those of you who are on just long-acting insulin, if you're on detamir insulin, or levemir, it's a trade name, you can reduce that type of insulin before you do your physical activity, but you need to give what's the residual amount when you finish the activity. This flow chart tries to bring those ideas together. So you can see starting, is the activity done in the fasting or post-absorptive state? So if it's done in the fasting state, you can consider basal dose infusion reductions or take extra carbohydrate. If you're on a pump, we're suggesting a 50% reduction to 80% reduction an hour to 90 minutes before. If it's done after your bolus dose, can the bolus dose be reduced? And if it can be, reduce it by between 25 and 75%. If it can't be reduced, the exercise is unplanned, all you can do is take extra carbohydrates, and we're suggesting the rate of 0.5 to 1 gram of glucose per kilogram of exercise per hour. And that will be typically no more than 60 grams. Once again, you can use your trend arrows, because if you find the first time you do the activity and you've given yourself, say, 20 grams of glucose per hour, if the glucose levels are still falling, you know next time to increase it to 30 and then to 40. But if, as one of my questions earlier on has come through, saying that your glucose arrows rise, you're over-replacing the carbohydrate. The maximum sprint. This is a really neat thing. So, and it's very encouraging. The body's responses are there, but they don't talk to each other in as coordinated a manner as normal. And it's an effect of having a high starting glucose and a high level of insulin under the skin. But you can trick the body into doing a response. So if you do star jumps or a sprint or burpees or whatever thing, anything that's going to really get your heart rate going for 10 to 20 seconds before you do the exercise, you'll produce a gratifying little boost of glucose, perhaps as high as 4 millimoles, which will keep your glucose up while you're exercising. It can also be done while you're doing the exercise. So I have seen a nice study where it's done every 20 minutes during a period of running. So people ran at their submaximal level and then sprinted for 10 seconds. And those sprints kept the glucose up without having to take all glucose. It can also be done at the end of the exercise if the glucose is continuing to fall, instead of taking an amount of glucose by mouth. The big advantage of this is that you can reduce the amount of carbohydrate you're taking. And if you're exercising to try and control your weight, it's a very nice way of doing that. I'm now moving on to a very difficult problem which people complain about bitterly, which is after they do the exercise, even if they've managed to control their diabetes control well during the exercise, they find they struggle to keep their blood sugar down afterwards. They often wrongly attribute it to either their personal mismanagement, they've done something wrong. There's a lot of blame goes on in type 1 diabetes, I'm afraid. Or they think it's because they've given too much carbohydrate. And although too much carbohydrate might be a contribution, the more likely explanation is that the hormone responses that are produced during exercise continue to work and push blood glucose up. There's another component, which is if you do anaerobic exercise and you produce a large amount of lactate, the lactate circulates back to the liver and 2 molecules of lactate join together to make 1 molecule of glucose, which is exported. So how can you deal with this post-exercise peak of glucose? Well, there are 2 strategies. The first is to do a cool down period of exercise. So do a low intensity jog for 5 to 10 minutes. Now, you may think that's ridiculous because you just come off the exercise or you don't have time to do that, but for some people, they can do that. If you don't feel you can do that, you can correct. And this very nice study, which has been published within the last few weeks, shows that if you use the same correction dose that you would use with a meal, it will work very nicely without causing hypoglycemia. So if your correction factor was, for example, 1 unit was typically brought your sugar down by 4 millimoles, and your glucose had risen after exercise to say 14, and you'd like it to be 8, you might like to give yourself 1.5 units. Well, you can't give yourself 1.5 units, so you just might try giving 1 and then coming out, have another go at it. What about some other neat techniques that are non-medical? So this is a really nice study. This is using the different trajectories of blood glucose response with different forms of exercise to your advantage. So in this study, they've taken young people with type 1 diabetes and they've asked them to do aerobic work first, followed by resistance exercise, or resistance exercise followed by aerobic work. And this informs us that if you go to the gym and your blood glucose is low, say less than 6, I've previously advised you to take some glucose. But there's a couple of other strategies. You could do a maximum sprint to push your blood glucose up, and then you could go in to do your resistance weightlifting work first, and then do your aerobic work second. But say another day, you went into the gym and your blood glucose was 12, you might then decide, actually, I need to do the aerobic work first, don't take extra carbohydrates, and let my glucose fall. And then once my glucose has begun to fall, do the resistance exercise. Once again, the FreeStyle Libre system is absolutely excellent for this because you'll have the trajectories there. One small word of warning, there is reduced reliability of the FreeStyle Libre system with exercise. So although the trend arrows remain very reliable, the absolute values tend to fall off a bit. So you can use the trends, but don't rely on the absolute arrows. So if you're feeling low, but the thing doesn't say you're low, it's because there's been a lag. I now want to move on to some summary ideas to get things together. So things to consider before you do your exercise. What type of exercise is it? Will your blood glucose go up? Will your glucose go up, or will it go down? And can that inform the order you do your exercise? How close is the exercise to the last injection? And will the meal injection still be working? Is the basal pump infusion rate okay, and do you need to change it? Is it too high for exercise? Have you had a hypo in the last 24 hours? Is it safe to exercise? By which I mean, if you've got a self-corrected glucose hypo, then that's it, and you corrected, that's fine. But if you had a hypoglycemic episode, you need another person, you probably shouldn't exercise because you're at high risk of another hypo. And then finally, is your glucose appropriate for the sort of exercise you're planning? And the values are slightly different if you're planning doing resistance or sprint exercise from aerobic exercise. So a summary sheet with the pros and cons. You can reduce the pre-exercise bolus dose. It works well for planned exercise, but it doesn't work if the exercise is more than 2 hours after the bolus dose. You can reduce the pre-exercise basal insulin, but again, it needs planning, and it only really works if you're on Levemir insulin. It doesn't work so well on Detamir, on Degludec, or on Glargine. You can take extra carbohydrates, and this remains the mainstay, and typically the ingestion rate for aerobic exercise should be between 0.5 and 1 gram per kilogram per hour of exercise, starting off perhaps 20 to 30 grams. If the exercise is more than an hour, you can begin to use more complicated carbohydrates such as bananas or flapjacks or cereal bars or whatever you do. But be aware that some of that may be absorbed when you finish doing exercise, which may contribute to your post-exercise hypoglycemia. I'm a big fan of insulin pump therapy, so If you're doing very frequent exercise of different types, then insulin pump therapy has major advantages. And then finally, for all forms of exercise, if you're doing exercise less frequently than every 2 to 3 days, you should consider reducing the basal dose by 10 to 20%, or the basal infusion rate by 10 to 20% on the night following exercise to avoid nocturnal hypoglycemia. I've really enjoyed preparing and talking to you guys on this. It's been my life's work to do this, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. Happy to take any of your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Gallen, and thank you, Chris, for your input at the start of tonight's webinar. So now we have about 15 to 20 minutes to do some questions, so I will slowly work through the list. So the first one's for Chris. Do you carb count everything you eat?
I certainly used to. At the early stage of diagnosis, that was absolutely my approach. And then I guess after a couple of years, I rather than sort of counting grams of carbohydrates as such, it was more recognizing that a certain amount of food on the plate would equal a certain amount of insulin that I would need to inject. So it's in effect the same thing as carb counting, but I guess for a simple rugby player such as myself, it almost made life just a bit easier to know that if I've got this much pasta on the plate, I need to inject this much insulin. And I kind of, that was certainly the way I worked early on.
Have you got anything to add to that, Dr. Gallen?
Yes, I have really. I think that it's very easy to make errors on carbs, because if you have for example, your typical bowl of breakfast cereal, and you put it in perhaps a little bit sloppily, it's quite easy on 3 different days to give yourself 30 grams, 25 and 35 grams. And between day 2 and 3, there's a more than 25% difference in carbohydrate intake, and that's going to have quite a big impact on your post-exercise, your post-breakfast insulin dose. So I do think it is important, and as you start to get higher amounts of carbohydrate, so some of the young people come and see me are on 400 or 500 grams of carbohydrate per day. So when you start to make 10% errors on carbohydrates around their meals, then you're talking about very big changes. So I do think it is important to try and do it as tightly as you can.
Okay, great. Thank you both. So the next question is again for Chris. What is your solution to hypos during your training sessions or games? What do you normally take?
For hypos, sorry.
Yeah, hypos.
I don't tend to have hypos during training sessions. I can sometimes have them sort of post-match, and that tends to be because I've had to inject insulin to try and keep my blood glucose levels at a level that I'm happy with during the game. But when I do have hypos, I tend to, as Dr. Gallen alluded to earlier, tend to look for a source of glucose. So dextrose tablets have sort of always been a bit of a go-to for me. But yeah, I guess these days it's sort of more few and far between where I need to sort of treat that quickly if I am starting to kind of trend low, and I can catch it early enough, then it might be that I choose a different option, something that isn't quite so rapid in terms of absorption. But during exercise, if I were dropping low, it would be a dextrose tablet or two.
Great. Another question is, what specific low GI foods do you tend to eat before you go to bed?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I mean, quite often people don't want to eat before bed, and sometimes that was a big frustration of mine. That, you know, do I really have to try and cram this food in when I'm about to go to sleep? But as I say, that was my technique at the time. It has changed since then, but my options would be sort of anything wholemeal, whole grain. Possibly sometimes I might save a bit of my evening meal. So if I've if I've had, I don't know, if I've had some sweet potato, for example, with my evening meal, I might try and hold a little bit of that back and almost have like a smaller version of my evening meal, just as a bit of a snack before bed. Yeah, so I'd kind of look along those lines. But to find out the GI of any food, Google's your best friend, really. You can look up an awful lot of information on there, and try and make some informed choices.
So can I just cut in there? Let's not forget protein as well. So protein has a glucose increasing effect, something that many of you have been surprised, because lots of you have been told that you can eat protein freely, but about half the amino acids are converted into glucose or glucose-like products. And so a protein load has a weak and late glucose-raising effect. And it's not dependent on insulin, it's dependent on how the liver metabolize it. So it's quite a neat way of having sustained low rise in glucose in the early part of the night.
Great, thank you so much. Someone has asked, what's the best way to lose weight using exercise as a type 1 diabetic?
Is that for me, do you think?
That's probably for Ian, yes.
Right, so this is, I'm so glad that somebody asked this. So if you, this is a complex interaction. If you're trying to control your diabetes well, you'll have a mixture of quick-acting insulin with your meals and long-acting insulin overnight. And if the amount of overnight insulin tends to stop you from breaking fat down while you're sleeping, so the normal cycle of food going into your body, being stored, and then being released at various times is broken. Now, you can't do much about that because you do need the long-acting insulin. So you need to increase the amount that comes out during exercise. And the best way of doing that is following glucose, so insulin sparing strategy. So exercise at a time where your insulin levels are low. So that will be first thing in the morning before your breakfast, without any insulin or taking any glucose. If your pre-exercise glucose is low, use the maximum sprint to raise it rather than glucose. Do low sustained submaximal aerobic exercise for at least 45 minutes on at least 3 to 4 days per week. If you can't do exercise in the morning, the next best time is at the end of the afternoon before your evening meal. Again, raising your glucose if it's low by the maximum sprint without taking extra glucose. And if you find your glucose is going low while you're doing it, sprint rather than taking glucose. Then try and take as little carbs as you can do, so be aiming for under 150 grams of carbohydrate or less, so that your prandial dose of insulin begins to drop. As you then continue to increase your physical activity, you'll become more sensitive to insulin overnight, so you'll be able to drop your basal dose of insulin, which then in turn will help you free fat to metabolize. So it's quite a big project that involves quite a few techniques.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ian. That sounded like a very good explanation. The next question, I think we've touched on this, but I think it's good to just readdress it. So someone's asked that they find weight training or explosive training, they get a rise, but that's then followed by a hypo a few hours later. Why is that?
Chris, do you want to answer that one? Because you probably do that all the time, and I'll give my steer on it.
Yeah, I was going to say I expect you know the scientific reason, but yeah, I'm in a similar boat. For me, it tends to be it is the explosive exercises, as you say, and I guess my understanding, and I may be completely wrong, but it's a sort of stressful situation. It's a stressful environment, so. I don't know if I'm right in saying this, but I kind of felt that the role of adrenaline would have something to do with the rise in glucose around those occasions. I think I might be right in saying, but hopefully Dr. Gallen will put me right. The post exercise drop. It's my understanding that the muscles are trying to replace the glycogen levels after you've kind of burnt them off. I might be completely wrong, but that was my kind of layman's understanding as to why the blood glucose would then drop post exercise. But Dr. Gallen will hopefully put me right, or at least say I'm kind of half right.
No, I'm not. You're not half right. You're completely right. I mean, I could go into more technical terms of what each of those things are, but I think your description is very useful for people. The stress the stress is actually manifested as hormones which push blood glucose up, and to manage that, people may take extra insulin to bring it down. The extra insulin may continue to act when you finish doing the exercise, and the muscles are hungry and take glucose up. So I think you described it beautifully.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Great teamwork there. Right, next question is from someone who tends to go trekking, so walking all day long. They've asked, should they reduce their long-lasting insulin dose for those days?
Oh, that's a very nice question. So it depends on what the long-acting one is. So if the person is on twice daily Levemir or Humulin I, they should certainly reduce the morning dose on the trekking. And then if their trekking finishes, say, mid-afternoon, give pro rata what was missing. So if you've missed out 6 hours or 8 hours, then give the residual 4 or 5 hours, whatever, back again when you come back from trekking. So that works well. Now, if you're on glargine or ibazaglar or Trasuba insulin, you can't do that because these are generally given at night time and they act for all through the day. And if you cut the long-acting insulin down the night before your planned trek, you won't have started the trek, so your sugars will be high all night, and you may not feel very well when you go out. So you can't really do that. Clearly, if you're on a pump, that's absolutely excellent because you can reduce the basal rate to a temporary basal rate while you're out trekking, and then restart it when you come back.
Great, thank you so much. The next question is probably one that's on quite a few people's minds, is how long after exercise are your glucose levels affected?
Well, Chris, you give your answer, and I'll back it up.
Yeah, well, my experience is that the most strenuous part of my week is on a Saturday afternoon or whenever it is I have a match, and I will always have a post game hypo, or at least my blood glucose will be dropping low, and I'll always need to treat that. I tend to then find that I can adjust my basal dosage slightly lower for the next. It's the next 2 days afterwards. I don't know what rhyme or reason that is, but that's just in my experience. I will reduce my basal dosage slightly for those 2 days, and then if say my exercise. If I have time off, or if a Monday training session is very light, or Tuesday training session is very light, I'll need to readjust and up it again. So for me, if it's something really intense, it can last 2 days in terms of the impact on my management.
So I would agree with every word of that. So, and I'll perhaps expand it why that's the case. So Chris noticed his blood glucose goes down, but some people notice it stays up for 2 or 3 hours immediately after exercise. But the bigger effect is on the sensitivity of muscles after you've done it. So the body produces more carrier proteins to take the glucose from the blood into the muscle after exercise, and that effect reaches its peak about 12 hours after the exercise and does last about 48 hours, exactly as Chris has noticed. So if you're doing the exercise every single day, you come to a new low sensitivity, which doesn't change. But if you're doing the exercise that's less severe every 3 days, then you'll have this cycle of being very sensitive to insulin, then less sensitive, and then normally sensitive afterwards. And of course, the opposite happens. If you stop exercising, you go from being sensitive to less sensitive, so you need to increase the dose of basal insulin. So Chris describes it very nicely, and there's good scientific evidence for his explanation.
Great. We've got another question about the sources of glucose. So just touching on someone wanting you to just confirm, Dr. Gallen, what you suggest are good sources of glucose compared to the fructose that you talked about earlier.
Okay, so the glucose comes in very few forms. So jelly babies, 2 jelly babies are about 8 grams. Dextrosol tablets, 3 of those are nearly 10 grams of glucose. There's 2 types of Lucozade. There's Lucozade Sport. So I think from memory, Lucozade isotonic is 5 grams in 100 mils. And there's regular Lucozade, which I think is about 10 grams in 100 mils. Or you can buy little sachets, which are quite expensive. And these contain, they're foil sealed. You can buy them in 15, 25, and 30 gram sachets. And there are bigger glucose tablets. And lastly, you can buy powdered sports drinks, and you can make those up into a dilution. You put 100 grams of powder into a litre, and 100 mils of that will give you 10 grams of glucose. And they're quite useful because they've got some salts in them often, and the combination of sodium and glucose together makes it very easy to absorb and less pleasant on your stomach.
Great, thank you so much for clarifying that. I think we have one last, we've got time for one last question. And I am going to have this one. Moderate walking and everyday activity, is this sitting as aerobic exercise?
Well, if it's just moderate walking, it should be. It is aerobic, but it's at a lowish level. It has very little effect on your glucose. So it will just be covered by your normal insulin and food program. But it is aerobic, okay. Yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Gallen, for that one. There's been quite a few people asking about that in relation to dog walking and just everyday activities.
Well, it depends on how fast you're going. If you're doing a slow dog walk and watching the dog walk around, very little effect. But actually, if you've got a hilly walk and you're going at a good speed, then yes, that will lower your blood glucose.
I've tried to cover the key points for you to take back, and I hope they've been useful. And I think I'm going to be taking some questions for the next few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ian, for that very comprehensive look at exercise with diabetes. Now, yes, as you said, we are going to take some questions if you're happy to answer some.
Yeah, of course, I'd be delighted to. I just give the warning, as you said, Ellen, because of various regulations, I can only describe general answers. I can't, if there's specific problems, I'll have to refer you back to your healthcare professionals.
Yes, indeed. So the first question is, would you recommend exercising in a fasting state? I know you touched on that earlier briefly, but someone has asked.
So the safest time to do aerobic exercise is when there's little insulin in your body. So first thing in the morning before breakfast, when your insulin levels overnight are low, is probably the safest time to do it. And the next safest time to do aerobic exercise is at the end of the afternoon before your evening meal. So yes, for sprint exercise like climbing and grappling, again, that's a bit more of a problem because low levels of insulin in your body will mean your glucose tends to rise. So those sorts of exercise can probably be more safely done after you've eaten, provided you had the shot of insulin to go with it.
Great. Next question. What is the best time after taking quick-acting insulin to exercise?
Well, I think I referred that to my previous answer. So if you want to do aerobic exercise and it's planned, you should halve, and I have many people who actually omit the dose completely if they're doing aerobic exercise. If after 2 hours, the majority of the quick-acting insulin has been absorbed, you've only got the tail of it, so it probably doesn't matter after 2 hours.
Okay, one that's to do with rowing. So this Gentleman is on a rower and he uses a pump. He's asked, what would you recommend with a start time on the river at 7:45?
So if you can program your pump to go down to a lower basal rate an hour before, and start off at 50% temporary basal rate, and then go below, you may need to go lower than that. Look at your trajectory of your FreeStyle Libre arrows. If you find your glucose is still falling without, say, a 50% reduction, reduce it still further. At 7:15, when you go onto the water, do a maximum sprint before you start, and be prepared to take glucose up to 60 grams per hour while you're rowing. And rowing is quite handy for that, because you can scan when you turn the boat round. Most bits of river are only under 2,000 meters, so you'll be able to scan every 10 minutes. If you find your glucose is still falling, then you need to give oral glucose in gel or drink form. But you may be able to manage without anything if you lower the basal rate and do a maximum sprint before you start. We have a lot of rowing in the Thames Valley, and I've got a lot of athletes who do that very successfully. And it's very important for that gentleman to understand that the physical performance is not impaired in rowing, as I think Steve Redgrave and other athletes have shown us.
Okay, thank you for that. Next question is that someone's been cycling for over 20 years with very good control. They started to do CrossFit, and they find the short 5 to 6 minute HIIT workouts increase their sugar levels up to 8 to 15. Should they inject fast-acting insulin before that class?
There's two. So I find that a lot, and I think I've tried to explain why that is. There's nothing wrong with that gentleman's body. It's working normally. So it depends on how high. If he's getting rises to under 15, I wouldn't give a corrective dose. But what I would do is arrange the CrossFit class so there's a longer period of lower intensity to bring the glucose down, and he can use his arrows to show that. The problem about giving the short-acting shots of insulin is, yes, it will control the peak of glucose nicely, but he will then have that sitting around after he's finished the CrossFit class, which might make him hypoglycemic. But I do have all sorts of athletes who do very stressful sports, boxing, judo, squash, who have to give a unit or 2 units before they do the physical activity to stop their sugar shooting up to the mid to upper teens. So I would sequence it by trying to use aerobic work to bring the glucose down. But if his sugar is going up too high, then a small corrective dose of insulin before is going to be needed. A really great question. Thank you.
Next then, what foods would you suggest are good to stable glucose after exercise?
Right, so we've very, very good question. Protein content is really important. So a mixture of low glycemic index food and protein. Protein is digested in a variety of ways and keeps the blood glucose steady for quite some time. So a high protein snack. In our working party, we recommended milk or milk-based products with some longer-acting carbs is a good snack.
Here's quite a topical question with the marathon happening next weekend. So we've got quite a few marathon runners listening. And one of the questions is, before exercise, sorry, I've just lost the question. No, completely gone, sorry. Next question. Before exercise, is it beneficial to purposely raise my blood sugar levels? Absolutely not.
So there's two variations with people with diabetes you need to be aware of. The first is the concept of carb loading. So carb loading, many pre-marathon people will indulge in very high amounts of carbs the day before. Now, the evidence to support that as a positive strategy outside of diabetes is not particularly strong, but in diabetes we know that's not a good thing to do. So it's more likely to cause glucose disturbance. So the increase in energy required to support running should be balanced out with all your meals in the previous week with a higher bolus dose of insulin. Going into the marathon, you may want to have your sugar up to sort of 12 before you go into it. Above 12, you'll start to becoming dehydrated, and that's a problem. Certainly don't be raising blood glucose to mid to upper teens as a method, because the amount of glucose in the blood is very little, and even if you were to raise your glucose to above 15, that only will account for between 10 and 15 minutes of exercise. It's all about rebalancing how the liver releases glucose and taking glucose in by mouth. So raising glucose to high levels does not protect against hypoglycemia and actually will impair performance substantially.
Okay, great. One question that's come in that might be of interest to quite a few people on the call is that you've talked about the difference between anaerobic and aerobic exercise quite a lot, but could you give a synopsis of what the difference between the two are?
Yeah, I'll apologise to all the listeners. I was remiss on that. So aerobic exercise is exercise that you can do pretty much endlessly, and that you can do it and you feel it's in your capacity. So in terms of your heart rate, it's below 85% of your maximum predicted heart rate. To work out your maximum predicted heart rate, it's 220 minus your age. So typically, it's exercise if you're in your 30s. It's typically exercise that has a heart rate of below 160 or thereabouts. So that exercise theoretically can last almost endlessly because the body is designed to do that. Now, anaerobic exercise is exercise that's very short-lived. It's exercise that you're using fuel at a faster rate than you can burn it, and so you accumulate acid in your blood and lactate in your blood. And you'll have had experience of that, because if you feel that you have this tightness in your chest and acid taste in your mouth, that's anaerobic exercise, and you can't carry on doing that endlessly. And that's typically seen when your heart rate is more than a maximum predicted heart rate of 85%. So those of you who watched the boat race last week, those young men and women whose heart rate was up in the 190s, they were performingly at the end of the exercise anaerobically. But the key to it is to make sure that you don't become anaerobic too soon, because you won't be able to finish the race.
Okay, great. Next is, what about hill walking for several hours? Mine usually falls at the start, and towards the end of the walk will rise. Not sure which group this falls into.
Well, that's the mixed format. It depends on how steep you're climbing. So the majority of that work will be aerobic. But if you've got a very steep, short section, that becomes more anaerobic. So that goes back to the mixed panel that I showed you in the first slide. And this is where the FreeStyle Libre really comes into its own, because you can see which way it's going. Part of the rise can be due to over replacement of glucose or carbohydrates early on.
Great. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. As a regular road cyclist, I cut my fast-acting insulin to just a few units. Would you consider reducing to 0, or could this have a detrimental effect on my performance?
Oh, that's such a good question. So it won't have any effect on your performance while you're doing it. But if you remove the insulin completely, it means that when you finish the activity, particularly after you've been cycling for many hours, when you come back to rest, you've got very little insulin in your body, and the hormones that your body makes to make your body work are full on. So if you have very little insulin in your body, there's a tendency for glucose to rise very quickly, and it can be quite difficult to get your metabolism back on control. So my advice would be, if you can, keep some insulin in the body so that there's less of a rebound when you finish the activity.
Okay, we've had quite a few questions on this, so it'd be great to hear you explain. When you say take glucose, is that Lucozade, Jelly Babies, or glucose tablets?
Your choice. So I'm really enjoying these questions from your listeners or your viewers. So doctors and nurses are very sloppy about sugar. So we often describe sugar and say take some sugar and your blood sugar or your and actually they're different. So the white stuff that's in bread, so in cakes, biscuits, sweets, and other drinks is sucrose. Sucrose is two sugars joined together, glucose and fructose. So when you eat it, it has to be digested, and that's not digested until it's got quite a long way down into your gut. And half of what you eat is not glucose. So if you take sugary-containing things, it doesn't raise your blood glucose quickly, but will leave you with a higher glucose later on. And you may have experienced that. Notice that you've had a hypo and you've taken some a Coca-Cola and it hasn't pushed your glucose up quickly enough, but you've then had high glucose later on. So what you need to take to raise blood glucose is glucose, and it comes in very few forms. Lucozade, there's Lucozade traditional, which has just been made less strong. Lucozade Sports, which has got 5 to 6 grams of glucose per litre. You can make your own powdered sports drink. If you go to any health food shop or Boots, there's glucose powder. And if you get glucose powder that's got salts in it, that's very useful. If you put 100 grams in a litre, that gives you a 10% solution. So 100 mils would be 10 grams of glucose. Jelly babies are about 4 grams of glucose each, so 2 of them is 8. Or dextrosol tablets, 3 of those is 10. Or you can buy gels, they're already in liquid form. If they're in liquid form, they're absorbed more quickly, and they will also clear your body more quickly. So that's the form of glucose you should be taking.
Great. You've talked a lot about people on a pump, but what can we do with insulin if not on a pump?
So if you're on the long or very long-acting insulins, either Glargine or Degludec, you can reduce the dose of Glargine by 10% when you finish doing the activity. That can also be done with Degludec to stop you getting hypoglycemic. If you're on twice daily Levemir insulin, it gives the opportunity of reducing the dose of Levemir on the morning you do the activity. So if you were, for example, a keen weekend cyclist and you're on twice daily Levemir, you might substantially reduce the Levemir on the morning of the cycling on Saturday or Sunday, or omit it completely and take a reduced dose when you return back from cycling. So that's the same sort of principle as a pump, but a bit applicable to subcutaneous insulin shots.
Great. You talked about caffeine having an effect in your glucose levels. Can you tell us more about the caffeine dose needed to have an effect? Is it a normal single espresso or?
No, so the studies that I did some time back, we took 5 times the daily average caffeine intake given an hour before. So that was proof of principle, and that's what we wouldn't recommend. And we used Pro Plus tablets, but it's unlikely that a single or double espresso will have very much effect. But some of the caffeinated drinks have more caffeine in them. Pro Plus is a useful thing to do. It's not very widely used as a supplement, but I have people come to see me who say that they find it a very helpful method, and would be a method of reducing the amount of glucose you took. So I would use that in the context of maximum sprint, so as I could advise less glucose while you're doing the sport, largely as a method of weight control.
And you mentioned maximum sprint there again. Someone's asked, does this technique work for everyone?
Well, obviously it won't work for everyone, but it's in some people will produce the same degree of counter-regulatory hormone response, but it's certainly worth a try.
Great. And then last question that we've got time for. I disconnect my insulin pump in order to exercise. 1 hour gym mix of aerobic and anaerobic. Is this wise?
So if you mean by disconnect, you take it off completely. There is some issue about the reservoir where the insulin is being infused into decompressing. So that strategy will make it less likely to have hypoglycemia, but it might be more difficult to control glucose afterwards. So I think if it's possible to keep the pump connected, but reduce or stop the infusion rate so as the well the infusion is going into is still pressurized, and that will make it easier to control when you restart, when the infusion is restarted afterwards.
Okay, and just one last question that's just come in that I don't think we've touched on at all, so I thought would be quite a useful question, is can you give any advice for children playing in the playground and doing exercise?
So I'm not a paediatrician, and the paediatricians who I work with on the various study groups tell me that child's playing is very complicated because it's not organized, and they can rush around, or they can just be sitting in the corner, and you don't know what they're going to do. So I think that all you can do for that is to let them play, look at their devices to find out what is happening with their glucose, and try and learn what the typical glucose responses are during their playing. And if you're finding that the glucose is falling, then probably the easiest and strategies is just to give glucose tablets to keep the glucose up. I think changing insulin dose is quite tricky for the short periods of play. And if the play is under half an hour, I certainly wouldn't be considering changing insulin doses at all.
Great. Well, unfortunately, that's all we've got time for this evening. I'd like to thank both Dr. Gallen and Chris for their time and their great presentations. This presentation will be available on demand in the coming days, and we will also email out a questionnaire to everyone. Thank you and good evening. Done. We're all done.